Most people wake up every day believing they know who they are. They say their name. They follow their routine. They react the same way to the same people, the same problems, the same triggers. And they call that identity. But what if that version of you isn't real? What if the person you defend, the personality you protect, the beliefs you argue for, were never truly yours to begin with? You weren't born with a fear of failure. You weren't born thinking you're not good enough. You weren't born believing success is for other people. Those ideas were planted. Carefully, repeatedly, quietly. And the most dangerous part, you didn't resist them. You accepted them. Not because they were true, but because they were given to you early enough to feel like truth. Think about it. The first time someone laughed at your mistake, the first time someone compared you to someone better, the first time you were told, you're not like them. You can't do that. Stay in your place. You didn't question it. You absorbed it. Because as a child, you don't filter reality. You trust it. And that's where your identity began to fracture. Not all at once, but piece by piece. A comment here, a rejection there, a failure that wasn't explained, just felt. And slowly, without realizing it, you started building a version of yourself designed not to grow, but to survive. You became quieter, not because that's who you are, but because being loud once got you judged. You became careful, not because you're naturally cautious, but because you learned mistakes come with pain. You became realistic, but what you really became was limited. And the most dangerous lie you accepted was this: this is just who I am. That sentence has destroyed more potential than failure ever could, because failure can be corrected. But identity is defended. You don't argue with it. You don't challenge it. You protect it. Even when it's destroying you, you say, I'm not confident. I'm not smart enough. I'm not the type to succeed. And every time you say it, you reinforce a version of yourself that was never truly chosen. It was inherited, conditioned, installed, like a program running in the background of your mind. And the worst part? It feels familiar. And familiarity feels safe. Even when it's toxic, even when it keeps you stuck in the same place, repeating the same patterns, attracting the same outcomes. You call it comfort. But it's not comfort. It's control, not your control. But the control of everything that shaped you before you had the awareness to question it. Look at your decisions, the risks you don't take, the opportunities you avoid, the conversations you never start. Do you really think those choices are yours? Or are they echoes of past moments where you learned what happens when you step out of line? Because every time you shrink yourself to fit into what feels normal, you're not being yourself. You're being trained by past experiences that taught you. Don't try too hard. Don't stand out. Don't fail again. And over time, you stopped asking what you want and started asking what feels safe. That's how identity becomes a prison, not one built with walls, but with beliefs, invisible, untouchable, but powerful enough to control every decision you make. You think you're choosing your life, but you're not. You're repeating it, and repetition feels like identity, but it's not. It's conditioning. Real identity is uncomfortable. It evolves, it changes, it questions itself. But the version of you that you protect, it avoids discomfort. It resists change. It stays exactly where it is, because that's where it feels real. But real doesn't mean true. It just means familiar. And familiarity can be manipulated. That's how people stay stuck for years, not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack opportunity, but because they're loyal to a version of themselves that was built from lies. Lies like, you're only valuable if others approve of you. You can't succeed without permission. You're not capable of more. Those lies don't sound aggressive. They sound reasonable. That's what makes them dangerous. Because you don't fight reasonable lies. You accept them. You build your life around them. And eventually, you forget they were ever lies to begin with. You start calling them facts. You say, that's just reality. But it's not reality. It's a narrative, a story that was repeated so many times. You stopped questioning it. And once a lie becomes your identity, you will defend it, even when it limits you, even when it hurts you, even when it keeps you exactly where you are, because changing it would mean admitting something uncomfortable, that the person you've been isn't the person you have to be. And that realization, it's not freeing at first, it's terrifying. Because if your identity is built on lies, then who are you without them? Without the excuses, without the limitations, without the story you've been telling yourself. Most people never go that far. They stay inside the lie. Because at least inside the lie, they know who they are. Even if that version is small, even if that version is stuck, it's predictable. And the human mind values predictability over truth. That's why people choose familiar pain over unfamiliar growth. Because growth demands something your identity resists: change. And not just external change, internal change. The kind where you start questioning your thoughts, where you hear yourself say, I can't do this. And instead of agreeing, you pause and ask, who told me that? Where did that belief come from? Was it experience? Or was it someone else's limitation, passed down to you? Because not every belief you have was earned. Most of them were borrowed from parents, from teachers, from society, from people who were also operating from their own limitations. And without realizing it, you inherited their fears, their doubts, their ceilings, and turned them into your identity. That's how deep it goes. You're not just living your own story. You're living pieces of other people's stories, layered into your mind until they feel like yours. And until you start separating them, you'll keep living a life that feels real, but isn't truly yours. Because real identity isn't something you discover. It's something you build, consciously, painfully, by removing everything that isn't you. Every belief that limits you, every fear that doesn't belong to you, every narrative that keeps you small. But here's the part no one tells you. When you start breaking those lies, your mind will fight back, hard, because your current identity sees change as a threat. It will tell you, this isn't you. You're forcing it. You're going to fail. Not because it's true, but because it's trying to protect the version of you it knows, even if that version is weak, even if that version is stuck. Because to your mind, familiar equals safe, and unfamiliar equals danger. So when you try to grow, it feels wrong. Not because it is wrong, but because it's new. And that's where most people quit. They mistake discomfort for misalignment. They think, this doesn't feel like me. But the truth is, it doesn't feel like the old you. And that's exactly the point, because the old you was built on lies. So of course the truth will feel unfamiliar. Of course growth will feel uncomfortable. Of course stepping into a new version of yourself will feel unnatural. Because you're not just changing your actions, you're rewriting your identity. And that process? It's not smooth. It's messy. It's confusing. There will be moments where you don't recognize yourself. Moments where your old habits pull you back. Moments where you question everything. But those moments, that tension, that discomfort, that's the breaking point of the lie. That's where the old identity starts to crack. And for the first time, you get a glimpse of who you could actually be. Not the version that was shaped by fear, not the version that was built to survive, but the version that chooses what to believe, chooses what to pursue, chooses who to become. And that's where power begins. Not in confidence, not in success, but in awareness. The awareness that your identity is not fixed. It's flexible. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You start noticing your patterns. You start catching your thoughts. You start questioning your limits. And slowly, you stop accepting lies just because they feel familiar. You start asking better questions. Not, is this who I am? But, is this who I want to be? And that one shift changes everything. Because identity stops being something you defend and becomes something you design. And when that happens, the control you thought you lost comes back. Not all at once, but piece by piece, in every decision you make differently, in every fear you face instead of avoid, in every belief you challenge instead of accept. And over time, you become someone new. Not because you forced it, but because you removed everything that wasn't true. And what's left isn't a perfect version of you. It's a real one. Unfiltered, unconditioned, unrestricted. And that version, it's been there the whole time, buried under years of lies, waiting for you to question them, waiting for you to break them, waiting for you to realize you were never the person you thought you were. You were just the person you were taught to be. And now, for the first time, you get to choose who you become next. But here's where it gets darker. Because choice sounds powerful until you realize what it demands. If you truly choose who to become, then you can no longer blame who you used to be. No more blaming your past. No more blaming your environment. No more hiding behind the identity that once protected you. Because once you see the lie, continuing to live it becomes a decision. And that's where most people hesitate. Not because they don't want change, but because change removes their excuses. It forces them to face something much deeper than fear of failure. It forces them to face responsibility. And responsibility is heavy, because it means every action, every habit, every result comes back to you, not to your parents, not to your past, not to the people who shaped you, to you. That level of ownership feels uncomfortable because it strips away the illusion that you're stuck. And if you're not stuck, then what's been holding you back all this time? That question is where the mind starts to resist again. It starts to whisper, maybe this is too much. Maybe I should just stay the same. Maybe I'm overthinking it. But that voice isn't wisdom. It's fear trying to sound logical. Because the moment you fully accept that your identity is flexible, you lose the comfort of certainty. You lose the safety of saying, that's just how I am. And now, every limitation you keep is something you're choosing. That realization cuts deep because it exposes something most people don't want to admit. Staying the same is easier than becoming better. Not physically, but mentally. Because becoming better requires you to confront the parts of yourself you've been avoiding. The insecurity you hide behind confidence. the laziness you disguise as waiting for the right time, the fear you label as being realistic. And once you see those patterns clearly, you can't unsee them. You start noticing how often you lie to yourself. Not big lies, subtle ones, the kind that protect your comfort. I'll start tomorrow. I just need more time. I'm not ready yet. But deep down, you know the truth. You're not waiting, you're avoiding. Avoiding the discomfort of becoming someone new. Because becoming someone new requires letting go of someone old. And that's where it gets painful. Because even if your old identity is limiting, it's still familiar. It still feels like you. And letting go of it feels like losing a part of yourself, even if that part is holding you back. That's the psychological trap. You confuse familiarity with identity. So when you try to change, it feels like you're betraying yourself. But you're not betraying yourself. You're outgrowing a version of yourself that was never meant to be permanent. Think about it. Every stage of your life came with a different version of you. The way you thought as a child is not the way you think now. The fears you had years ago don't affect you the same way today. The things you believed have already changed. So why do you treat your current identity like it's final? Why do you protect it like it's fixed? Because this version feels stable, and stability feels safe. But growth destroys stability. It forces you into uncertainty, into situations where you don't have all the answers, where you don't feel in control. And the mind hates that. It would rather keep you in a limited identity that feels predictable than push you into a powerful identity that feels unknown. That's why people stay stuck for years. Not because they can't change, but because they unconsciously choose not to. They say they want more, but their actions protect what they already have. A familiar identity, a predictable life, a controlled level of discomfort, and anything that threatens that gets rejected, even if it's an opportunity, even if it's growth, even if it's exactly what they claim to want. Because desire means nothing. If identity doesn't support it, you can want success. But if your identity is built on the belief that you're not capable, you will sabotage yourself. You can want confidence. But if your identity is built on past rejection, you will hold yourself back. You can want change. But if your identity is attached to comfort, you will resist it. That's the hidden mechanism. Your life doesn't change when your goals change. It changes when your identity changes. And identity doesn't change through motivation. It changes through confrontation. You have to confront your patterns relentlessly. You have to catch yourself in the moment you're about to repeat the same behavior. And choose differently. Not once, not twice, but consistently. And at first, it will feel forced, unnatural, like you're acting. Because you are. You're acting against years of conditioning, and that takes effort. But here's what most people don't realize. Your current identity was built the same way, through repetition, through consistent thoughts, consistent actions, consistent reactions. You didn't become who you are overnight. You became this version of yourself by reinforcing it over time. So if you want to become someone new, you have to do the same thing. But consciously, you have to think differently, repeatedly, act differently, repeatedly, respond differently, repeatedly, until it stops feeling forced and starts feeling natural. That's how identity shifts. Not through a single breakthrough, but through small, consistent contradictions of your old self. Every time you do something your old identity wouldn't do, you weaken it. Every time you challenge a belief you used to accept, you loosen its control. Every time you step into discomfort instead of avoiding it, you expand what feels normal. And over time, your definition of yourself begins to change. Not because you told yourself it would, but because you proved it through action. That's where real confidence comes from. Not from thinking you're capable, but from repeatedly acting like you are, until your mind has no choice but to accept it. And that's when the shift happens. Quietly, without announcement. You stop asking, "Can I do this?" and start assuming, "I'll figure it out." You stop seeing challenges as threats and start seeing them as tests. You stop protecting your identity and start evolving it. And that's when life starts to respond differently. Not because the world changed, but because you did. Your decisions become sharper. Your focus becomes clearer. Your tolerance for excuses disappears. And suddenly, the things that once felt impossible become manageable. Not easy, but possible. And possibility is where everything begins. But even at this stage, the process doesn't stop. Because identity isn't something you fix once. It's something you constantly refine. There will always be new levels, new fears, new limitations trying to form. And if you're not aware, you'll fall into the same trap again. You'll build a new identity and start treating it like it's permanent. You'll get comfortable and stop questioning, and slowly, new lies will take root. That's why awareness is everything. Not temporary awareness, but continuous awareness. The ability to observe yourself without immediately believing everything you think. Because your mind is still influenced by your past, even after growth, even after change. It will still try to pull you back into old patterns. Not because you're weak, but because those patterns are familiar. And familiarity doesn't disappear overnight. It fades with repetition, with conscious effort, with time. So the real power is not in becoming a new person once. It's in becoming adaptable, flexible, unattached to any fixed version of yourself. Because the moment you become too attached to an identity, you limit your potential again. You start saying, "This is who I am now. This is what I do. This is my limit." And without realizing it, you create a new box, maybe bigger than the last one, but still a box. And growth doesn't live inside boxes. It lives in expansion, in questioning, in refusing to settle into a version of yourself that feels complete. Because the truth is, you are never complete. You are always evolving, always changing, always capable of more than you currently believe. But only if you stay aware. Only if you keep questioning. Only if you refuse to accept any belief, just because it feels familiar. That's the real escape. Not from the world, but from the unconscious patterns that shape your perception of it. Because once you break free from those patterns, you stop reacting to life and start creating it. And creation requires intention. You don't just wake up and become someone new. You decide, deliberately, who you want to be, how you want to think, what standards you want to live by. And then, you align your actions with that decision. Not perfectly, but consistently. And over time, that consistency becomes identity. Not an identity you inherited, but one you built, one you chose, one that reflects your values, not your past conditioning. And that kind of identity is powerful because it's not fragile, it's not dependent on approval, it's not shaken by failure. because it's grounded in something deeper than external validation. It's grounded in self-awareness. And self-awareness is the one thing that can't be taken from you. Because once you see yourself clearly, you can always adjust, always improve, always evolve. And that's the difference between people who stay stuck and people who grow. It's not intelligence. It's not luck. It's not opportunity. It's awareness. The willingness to question what feels true, and the courage to change it, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it feels unnatural, even when it means letting go of everything you thought you were. Because at the end of the day, your identity is not your past. It's not your mistakes. It's not the labels you were given. It's the choices you make, repeatedly. And if those choices are based on lies, your life will reflect them. But if those choices are based on truth, even uncomfortable truth, your life will start to align with something real, something intentional, something yours. And that's the moment everything shifts. Not because the world changed, but because you stopped living as someone you were taught to be and started living as someone you chose to become. And once you reach that point, there's no going back. Because you've seen behind the illusion. You've seen how identity is formed, how it's manipulated, how it can be rewritten. And once you know that, you can never fully believe the lie again. You might feel it. You might fall back into it sometimes. But deep down, you'll always know. You have the power to change it. And that knowledge is what separates those who stay controlled from those who take control. Because in the end, your identity is not something you find. It's something you build or something you accept. And now that you see the difference, the real question is no longer, who am I? The real question is, what lies am I still choosing to believe? And what happens when I finally stop? That question doesn't just sit in your mind. It follows you. It shows up in quiet moments, when there's no distraction left, when you're alone with your thoughts, and something feels off. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet discomfort, a sense that something about your life doesn't fully align. And most people do something very specific in that moment. They escape it. They reach for their phone. They distract themselves with noise. They bury that question under routine. Because if they don't, they might have to answer it. And answering it means facing something deeper than fear. It means facing truth without filters. And truth doesn't negotiate with your comfort. It exposes. It strips away the story you've been telling yourself and replaces it with something raw, something honest, something that forces you to see the gap between who you are and who you could be. That gap is dangerous, not because it hurts, but because it demands action. Once you see it clearly, you can't pretend it doesn't exist. You can't go back to unconscious living. You either move toward that higher version, or you consciously choose to stay where you are. And that's where internal conflict begins. Because part of you wants growth, but another part wants familiarity. One side of you is pushing forward, the other is pulling back. And this tension, this silent battle, is what most people live with for years. They don't fully move forward, but they also can't fully go back. They exist in between, comfortable enough to stay, but uncomfortable enough to feel it. That's the trap, because in that state, nothing changes. You're aware, but not active. You see the lies, but you don't break them. And over time, that awareness without action becomes frustration. You start feeling stuck, not because you don't know what to do, but because you're not doing it. And that frustration builds. Quietly at first, then louder, until it starts affecting everything. Your mood, your energy, your motivation. Because deep down, you know you're capable of more, but you're not stepping into it. And that disconnect creates a kind of mental pressure. A pressure that doesn't come from the outside world, but from within. From the version of you that's waiting for you to act, waiting for you to stop hesitating, waiting for you to finally break the pattern. But waiting has a cost. Every day you delay, you reinforce the old identity. Every time you choose comfort over growth, you strengthen the same patterns you say you want to escape. And slowly, that potential version of you starts to feel further away. Not because it disappeared, but because you stopped moving toward it. And here's the part most people don't want to admit. You don't lose your potential overnight. You abandon it gradually, through small decisions, small compromises, small moments where you choose what's easy instead of what's necessary. And those small choices compound. They shape your habits shape your behavior reinforces your identity. And just like that, you're back where you started. Not because you failed, but because you repeated. That's how powerful patterns are. They don't need dramatic events to control you. They operate in the background, in your daily routine, in your automatic reactions, in the decisions you don't even think about anymore. That's why breaking them feels so difficult. Because you're not just changing what you do, you're interrupting what feels natural. And anything that interrupts what feels natural feels wrong at first, even if it's right. That's the paradox. The right path often feels uncomfortable because it's unfamiliar. And the wrong path feels comfortable because you've walked it so many times. So if you rely on feelings alone, you'll stay stuck. You'll keep choosing what feels right instead of what is right. And that's how people stay trapped in cycles they don't even like. They wake up, repeat the same routine, think the same thoughts, make the same choices, and at the end of the day, they wonder why nothing changes. But nothing changes because they didn't. Not at the level that matters. Surface changes don't break deep patterns. You can change your environment. You can change your schedule. You can even change your goals. But if your identity stays the same, everything eventually resets. You return to the same mindset, the same habits, the same results. Because identity is the root. And if you don't change the root, the outcome doesn't change. It just gets delayed. That's why some people make progress, only to lose it later. Because they change their actions, but not their beliefs. They force discipline without shifting identity. And discipline alone doesn't last forever. Eventually, your identity pulls you back. Back to what feels normal. Back to what feels like you. And that's why real change is internal first. It's not about doing more, it's about becoming different. And becoming different requires something most people avoid. Honest self-confrontation, not surface-level reflection, not motivational thinking, real confrontation. The kind where you sit with yourself and ask uncomfortable questions. Where are you lying to yourself? What are you avoiding? What excuses are you repeating? And more importantly, why? Why do you keep choosing comfort over growth? Why do you hesitate when you know what to do? Why do you hold on to beliefs that limit you? Those questions don't have easy answers. And that's why most people don't ask them. Because answering them requires accountability. It requires you to stop pointing outward and start looking inward. And once you do that, everything becomes clearer. Not easier, but clearer. You start seeing your patterns, not as random events, but as predictable behaviors. You start understanding your triggers, the moments where you default back to old habits, the situations where your old identity takes over. And once you see those patterns clearly, you gain something powerful. Choice, real choice, not the illusion of choice you had before, but conscious choice. The ability to pause in the middle of a pattern and decide differently. That moment, at that pause, is where transformation happens. Not in big dramatic changes, but in small interruptions. In choosing a different response, in acting despite discomfort, in doing what your old identity would avoid. And every time you do that, you shift something. Not instantly, but gradually. Like a slow recalibration of who you are. And over time, those small shifts add up. They change your habits. Your habits change your behavior. Your behavior reshapes your identity. And suddenly, you're not the same person anymore. Not because you forced it, but because you became it. And that's when something interesting happens. The things that once felt difficult start to feel normal. The actions you used to avoid become automatic. The mindset you had to remind yourself of becomes your default. And that's when you realize identity isn't something you think about anymore. It's something you live, without effort, without resistance. But even then, the process doesn't end, because growth has no final point. There's always another level, another version of you waiting, another set of limitations to break. And if you stop questioning, if you stop evolving, you fall back into the same cycle. You get comfortable again. You settle again. You start accepting new lies that feel like truth. That's why the real skill is not just breaking your current identity. It's staying aware enough to never get trapped again, to constantly observe your thoughts, to question your beliefs, to challenge anything that feels limiting, even if it feels familiar. Because the moment you stop questioning, you start accepting. And the moment you start accepting, without awareness, you become controlled again, not by others, but by your own unconscious patterns. And that's the real danger. Not external control, but internal conditioning you're unaware of. Because you can fight external pressure. You can resist other people's expectations. But if the limitation is inside you, you won't even see it as a limitation. You'll see it as reality. And you'll live your entire life inside it, without ever realizing there was more. That's why awareness is freedom. Not comfort, not ease. Freedom. Because it gives you the ability to see beyond what you've been taught, beyond what you've accepted, beyond what feels normal. And once you see beyond it, you can choose differently. You can act differently. You can become something different. And that's where life changes. Not in one moment, but in a series of decisions. Decisions that go against your old patterns. Decisions that challenge your current identity. Decisions that move you closer to the person you want to become. And those decisions, they won't always feel good. They won't always feel right. But they will be right, because they align with growth, not comfort. And if you keep choosing them, again and again, something shifts permanently. You stop asking for permission. You stop waiting for the right moment. You stop identifying with the version of you that hesitates. And instead, you become someone who acts, someone who decides, someone who moves forward, regardless of how it feels. And that's when control fully returns. Not control over everything, but control over yourself, your thoughts, your actions, your direction. And once you have that, everything else becomes secondary. Because no matter what happens externally, you know you can adapt. You know you can change. You know you're not fixed. And that knowledge is the most powerful thing you can have. Because it means no matter where you are right now, no matter what you've believed up until this point, no matter how long you've lived inside those patterns, you are not stuck. You were never stuck. You were conditioned. And conditioning can be broken, rewritten, replaced. But only if you're willing to question everything you've accepted and rebuild it from truth. Not comfortable truth, not convenient truth, real truth. The kind that challenges you, the kind that forces you to grow, the kind that doesn't let you stay the same. Because at the end of all this, after all the questioning, all the discomfort, all the change, you arrive at something simple, something most people overlook. You realize your identity was never the problem. The lies were. And now that you see them, you have a choice. Keep living them, or finally let them go. And that choice, repeated every day, becomes your new identity.